What if I told you some hospitals in Ohio never discharged their patients because their spirits never left? Tonight we'll uncover 11 of the most haunted hospitals in the state, where footsteps echo in empty corridors, shadows move without a source, and whispers drift through the halls of the abandoned wards. These chilling tales aren't just rumors. They're the stories that locals, nurses, and even police officers refuse to forget. Welcome to Blink News, where we bring you the mysteries that keep America awake at night. If you love true hauntings, spine-chilling history, and the darkest secrets hiding in plain sight, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Blink News, and ring the bell icon. Because what you're about to hear will make you think twice before ever stepping inside an old hospital again.
Molly Stark Sanatorium. Imagine a sprawling Spanish Revival structure rising from Ohio's rolling farmland, built with one purpose: to heal those consumed by what was known as the White Plague. Molly Stark Sanatorium, named after the wife of Revolutionary War hero John Stark, opened its doors on August 23, 1929, in Nimishillen Township, Stark County, Ohio. Designed by Albert Thayer from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, its architecture, with generous porticos, balconies, rooftop verandas, and broad windows, embodied the era's belief that sunlight and fresh air were as powerful medicine as any drug. Inside the sanatorium, 150 TB patients were housed across a campus that included a children's hospital, nurses' quarters, a superintendent's residence, and a power plant, all connected by nearly 1,200 feet of underground tunnels, completed by the WPA in 1938, offering both utility access and secret pathways through the cold and rain. By 1952, bolstered by rising demand and despite TB's decline, the facility expanded with east and west wings designed by Charles Firestone, mirroring other regional architecture. As antibiotics advanced, TB cases dwindled. By 1956, the sanatorium had shifted its mission to become Molly Stark Hospital, treating general medical, geriatric, rehabilitation, and substance abuse patients. The final TB patients transferred out by 1970, and the hospital eventually closed its doors in 1995 due to aging infrastructure and falling demand. After intriguing proposals for redevelopment failed, Stark County sold the property to Stark Parks for $1 in 2009, transforming the grounds into Molly Stark Park, complete with walking trails, picnic areas, and a way to honor its complex legacy. However, as of late 2024, demolition plans received a grant and now loom over the fate of the once beautiful building. But the sanatorium's walls don't just tell a medical story. They murmur tales. Voices echo in the corridors. Dark shadows drift across the upper floors, and visitors report feeling watched by a figure that moves just at the edge of sight. That tension between a sanctuary of healing and a silent ruin haunted by memory is where the real chill of Molly Stark begins. Story 1. Whispers in the corridors, voices and shadows. There's a chill that hits when you walk the planked path toward the old building's main entrance. The air feels too thick, like it's holding its breath. Once inside, the silence is the first thing that strikes you. And then you hear it. A faint murmur echoing from a long corridor. I stood there for a moment, trying to pinpoint its source. Was it the wind slipping through broken windows? A puzzled bird fluttering through the halls? Or something else entirely? Visitors, sometimes called urban explorers or paranormal investigators, report hearing voices where none should be. They speak of low, urgent whispers that ricochet off the walls, sounding like patients calling for nurses who never came. Others recount seeing shadows that drift across walls or staircase openings, their edges unfixed, blurred as if they refuse to be fully seen. One person said they glimpsed a dark shape gliding down a hallway on the upper floor, pausing as though waiting, before vanishing into brick and broken glass. To understand why these stories cling to the place, I looked into daily life at the sanatorium in its heyday. In the 1930s and 40s, TB patients awaited breath and healing on sunlit balconies, days structured around fresh air therapy and rest. Isolation was common. Patients lived separated from family, with routines that branded their bodies and minds with time and disease. As years passed, those routines gave way to new uses. The place was no longer just a TB sanctuary, but a general hospital where staff and patients alike faced the same haunted labs and unused wards. As infrastructure aged, whispers are said to slip from the walls, fragments of ambulant footsteps, labored sighs, or even distant sobs. Even if they're echoes of history, they still feel like the past refusing to fade quietly. Whether it's acoustic quirk, stray wind, or some deeper human presence, the stories persist. When I asked a longtime park ranger if he'd ever experienced something uncanny, he leaned in quietly and said, "It's quiet here, except when it suddenly isn't." Blink News doesn't traffic in ghosts. We dig into the layers beneath. At Molly Stark, you can't separate structure from story or history from haunting. These corridors were built for healing, but the weight of sorrow doesn't disappear when the patients do. If you've ever felt a whisper in an empty room, you know that silence can carry its own kind of message. Like this exploration? Press like, subscribe to Blink News, and ring the bell. You're invited to walk with us into places where history whispers and not everything stays buried. Story 2, The Shadow on the Balcony, a Stalk on the Upper Floors. Those upper floor balconies were once sanctuaries under an open sky, places for a patient to breathe, wrapped in blankets even in winter, hoping that cold air would kill the TB bacteria. But now, they're overrun by vines and decay, with moss-damp railings and fractured tile underfoot. People speak of a dark figure stalking up there, a tall, limbless shape that appears at the edge of vision before dissolving. One explorer told me how he climbed there at twilight. I paused halfway up, and there, on the balcony, I saw something. Nothing human. A silhouette that seemed to absorb light, then disappeared when I blinked. Its presence, people say, is most often seen or felt after dusk. Some attribute these figures to grief unexpressed. Imagine years of patients walking the same halls, longing for fresh air, but knowing freedom was not a promise. In the absence of caretakers, their memory may have folded into shadow, but there's also a very human lens. Abandoned buildings echo imagination, and sadness can manifest in shape and form. Humidity, bird flaps, tree branches against glass, a natural stage for fear to play out. A skeptic I met said, "It's grown vines and broken glass. Still, the hair on your neck stands when you're up there alone." While bolstered by folklore, these sightings aren't just ghost stories. They're how we process places where so many lived and died. Molly Stark wasn't just medical, it was emotional. Generations expected care, and instead found isolation. That lingering shadow? Maybe it's grief asking for names, not guesswork. Not every presence demands a final explanation, but every presence deserves attention. Lima Tuberculosis Hospital. If a building could hold a breath, the old Lima Tuberculosis Hospital would still be exhaling. Perched at the eastern edge of Garden Boulevard, the red brick complex opened its doors on April 5, 1911, as the Lima District Tuberculosis Hospital, one of Ohio's earliest dedicated sanatoria built to fight the White Plague. From the start, it was a place designed for long stays. Patients, sometimes children, often remained for years under the regimen of fresh air therapy, rest, and routine that doctors hoped would tame a disease that could take a life slowly and publicly. The hospital began small, a 24-bed facility, but demand ballooned with outbreaks and population shifts. By the late 1920s, expansions were underway, and over time, the institution saw remodels that pushed capacity and altered its mission. As antibiotics and medical practice evolved, so did the site's uses. After decades of treating TB and other chronic illnesses, the facility fell out of use and was shuttered in the early 1970s, commonly reported as closed by 1973, leaving behind a campus of empty wards, decaying rooms, and the silent architecture of a medical era now vanished. Abandonment changed the hospital's narrative. Where nurses once moved beds and doctors made rounds, trespassers left graffiti, urban explorers climbed through broken windows, and neighbors worried about collapsing roofs and asbestos. Local law enforcement periodically boosted patrols to stop illegal entry, and county officials later sought brownfield grants to demolish the unsafe shells. A recognition that the site was both a public safety hazard and a repository of uncomfortable memory. That vacancy also fed folklore. Reports circulated of disembodied voices, apparitions of former patients, sudden cold spots, and the sense of a place slipping in time. Time slips. Where visitors say the hallways feel suspended between decades. Underground tunnels and maintenance passages, once practical arteries for staff and utilities, now populate stories of vanished footsteps and strange echoes beneath the building. Whether you call these claims paranormal or acoustic, they point to what the building keeps: a layered history of sickness, care, isolation, and finally, neglect. Walking past the gates today or peering at weathered shingles from across the street, you see more than collapsing masonry. You see a place that remembers the long fights against disease and the people who, for years, could not just walk back out into their lives. Those memories are the reason Lima's old TB hospital still makes the local headlines, and why, for many, it remains a place that refuses to be simply abandoned. Story 1: Echoes of the White Plague. The nurse's record. The envelope was brittle when I found it in a box at the county archives. A handful of nurses' daily logs from the Lima Tuberculosis Hospital. The handwriting was tight, practical. Names, medications, meal choices, and a line on sleeper cough intensity. The dates ran like a small ledger of hope and loss through the 1940s and 50s. I held one page and felt, for an instant, the slow heartbeat of a place that had kept watch over people for years. Reading those entries, patterns emerged. A child would be listed as admitted, then improving for months as sunlight and regimen did their work. Later, a terse note. Declined overnight. Respirations 48. Passed. Another line. Family contacted. None. Sometimes the log became the last paper that named a person. The hospital's routine fostered intimacy and distance at once. Nurses who cared in the daylight, procedures that kept individuals separated to prevent contagion. That separation, the record showed, could become its own form of erasure. One name returned again and again in that box of pages. A woman listed as Evelyn Marshall. Admitted in late 1946 at age 28. The nurse's tone in the log was gentle when Evelyn's cough reduced after a month of rest and sunlight. Then, in March, the entries grew sparse and mechanical. On March 12th, the nurse wrote, Evelyn restless, disoriented. Cold MD. Sedative given. Family unknown. 2 days later. Acute decline. Death pronouncement. 3/14/47. There was no obituary in the local papers I scanned. Evelyn's file held a faint photograph, a solemn woman in a plain dress, and a folded slip noting burial in a hospital cemetery. Those hospital burial records, and the way so many ended up in numbered plots or unmarked graves, turned the place into something more than a medical campus. It became a place of disappearance. People who were poor, estranged from family, or marked by social stigma, sometimes died there and were never reclaimed. In the nurses' logs, this reality shows not as scandal, but as quiet inevitability. Small notes, last rites performed, the ledger moving on. When I visited the site, the boarded windows and rotted porches felt like a mausoleum of ordinary details. Peeling wallpaper where a child's crayon still clung, a rusted oxygen tank in a storage room, an old calendar pinned to a bulletin board stuck on April, I imagined Evelyn on a sun terrace, the air sharp and thin, thinking of home she could not reach. It's easy, from a modern distance, to romanticize such a scene. But archives and oral histories make clear that hospitals like Lima were often understaffed and overwhelmed. Even kind, dedicated nurses sometimes had to watch lives ebb while resources lagged. There are reports, from local residents, from urban explorer accounts, that years after closure, people visiting the decayed ward still hear soft female humming in empty rooms, or feel the sensation of being watched while passing a certain ward where the sun once pooled on tile. Walkers near the property told me they sometimes hear what sounds like someone singing an old hymn at dusk. Are these echoes literal leftovers of sound in the architecture? Acoustic anomalies happening in long hallways and tunnels? Or are they memory made audible by a place that once held breath after breath? The nurse's log suggests an answer that is less supernatural and more human. The hospital held so much of life and death that it absorbed patterns, voices, rhythms, and releases them when we press our ear to the ruins. I spoke to one woman whose grandfather worked maintenance at the hospital through the 1950s. He told her a story he hadn't told many people. One winter midnight, when the furnace failed and calls came in, he'd walked the corridors with a lantern and heard distinctly soft singing from room 12, a lullaby. He said the tune stopped when he knocked on the door and found it empty. The maintenance man's explanation was practical. The building is full of drafts, conduit-made whistles, pipes. But his voice grew quiet when he added, "Still, I felt like I should put the lantern down and listen. It felt like someone I knew was still keeping watch." Archives give us the bare facts. Admission dates, census numbers, the slow decline in TB cases that eventually made such hospitals obsolete. But the paper cannot capture every hush and every gesture. The nurses' logs, practical, unadorned, are the opposite of spectacle. They show ordinary human labor in an extraordinary context. The humming, the whispered names in the night, the small rituals for those without family. These are not just ghost stories. They are the aftershocks of a place that held a generation's breath until it let go. If you want to know what haunts a hospital, start with the paperwork and the people who wrote it. That's where the traces linger. And if you found this look into Lena's nurse's ledger compelling, please like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. We'll keep opening boxes, reading the handwritten traces, and telling the human stories the headlines miss. Story 2, Beneath the Floorboards, the Tunnel Keeper. Beneath the maze of rooms and sun terraces, hospital networks hide other maps. Maintenance corridors, steam conduits, and service tunnels that connect buildings out of sight. At Lima, those arteries once moved coal, laundry carts, and the hushed steps of night staff. In years after closure, the tunnels became the stuff of rumor, a subterranean maze where the air cools fast and where, some visitors swear, time rearranges itself. Local urban explorers talk about the tunnels with a special vocabulary. The artery, the subfloor, the boiler loop. One long post described descending into a maintenance hatch and walking for what felt like minutes through darkness before, emerging in a basement room that didn't match the entrance. A disorienting mismatch of staircases and corridor angles. Those who've had similar experiences describe a sensation akin to a time slip, a brief dislocation in which clocks appear slow, a watch runs minutes behind, or a corridor seems to stretch. Skeptics point to low light, vertigo, and adrenaline. Historians point to architecture. Old service tunnels were built in phases, patched and rerouted, and can confuse anyone unfamiliar with their plan. What changes a rumor into a record is a single corroborated memory. I found one in a typed oral history collected by a local historical society. A retired janitor named Harold Jensen, who worked at the hospital through the 1960s. Jensen described the underground passageways as a place where the building remembers what it was used for. He told the interviewer about a night when, carrying a toolbox, he walked a maintenance route and felt an odd pressure in his chest. His pocket watch, which he wound every night, stopped, then resumed minutes later with no explanation. Jensen explained that he chalked it up to old mechanisms, but the memory stayed with him when he retired and told the story to his children. That testimony anchors other explorers' claims. The tunnels are physically odd, and when you're down there, your sense of time can be unreliable. In 2012, I met an urban explorer who asked to be named only by his handle. He recounted going into the basement with a small camera. It was about 3 a.m., he said. The lights were out, and I had one headlamp. I walked a stretch that should have taken 10 minutes. When I came up, my phone clock said I'd been gone an hour longer than I remember. My battery was drained in a way I couldn't explain. I felt lighter, like I left something down there. He confirmed that he found old staff shoes in a side room, a pair of nurses' clogs crusted with years of dust, and a rusted laundry cart with a tag listing a ward number. These are the artifacts that make a place testify to its past. There are reasons these tunnels can play with perception. The architecture is multi-layered, built in stages across decades, patched through wartime retrofits and later repairs. Lighting is inconsistent. Concrete and brick can create acoustic reflections that turn footsteps into distant voices. The human mind, too, is a storyteller. In low light and isolation, it fills gaps with meaning. But I met a former county official who toured the property with engineers and spoke of odd readings on their instruments. Electromagnetic fluctuations and air pressure differences at certain junctions. The engineers suggested those anomalies resulted from buried utilities and moisture gradients. The official, pragmatic and reluctant to indulge in lore, still confessed that, walking the tunnels, you get this feeling like someone else was there hours before you. Most haunting claims about the tunnels are not malevolent. They are small, uncanny interruptions. A watch that stalls, a camera that loses time, the sense of having been watched around a corner. But there was one account I could not easily explain away. A retired nurse told a local reporter about finding a row of children's toys beneath a service hatch. Dolls and marbles, carefully grouped as if placed in a remembrance. She insisted she had never seen them before, and when she returned the next week, they were gone. The nurse's voice as she recounted the story caught on the detail that the toys had not been scattered by rats. They were deliberately arranged. Was it a prank, an artifact moved by an explorer, or an unrecorded grave marker left by someone who remembered names? I could not prove a cause, but the details stayed with me like a bracketed silence. What do such stories add up to? They aren't proof of ghosts. They are a record of a building's afterlife. How architecture, memory, and human narrative fold into one another. Tunnels make sense of function and produce unease in their abandonment. They hold artifacts and accidents, engineering oddities, and personal memory. Walking them, you feel the life of the place, the shuffling rhythm of staff shoes, the smell of pine cleaner and kerosene, the urgent hush of late-night patients coughing in rooms above. If there is a haunting in Lima, it's not malevolence, it's persistence, of memory that will not lie down. Fairfield County Infirmary. If buildings could keep secrets, the brick mass that sits just off Granville Pike in Lancaster would be a vault. The site that became the Fairfield County Infirmary began life in 1828 as a wooden county poorhouse, a place meant to shelter the indigent, the elderly, the orphaned, and the infirm. By 1840, the county replaced that frame structure with the sturdier Italianate brick building whose facade still stares across Route 37. Long windows, broad steps, and an institutional calm that promised care, but often delivered something much stranger. For well over a century, the infirmary functioned as a small civic city. Wards, a working farm, laundry facilities, and a pauper's cemetery, tucked into the trees where residents who died without family were laid to rest. Over time, the role shifted. Civil War widows, the chronically ill, and those with no one else to claim them became the daily reality. By the mid-20th century, modern social safety nets and changing medical practice reduced demand, and the building's uses were repurposed and reshaped. County offices occupied portions of the structure until the health department moved out, and the building was vacated in 2013. Abandonment is a loud thing when it's a slow one. Windows were boarded, paint peeled, and relics, old hospital carts, rusted beds, and yellowed notices, lay like personal artifacts frozen in place. That physical pause allowed another layer to settle: folklore. Paranormal investigators, documentaries, and adrenaline-hungry visitors began to catalog voices in empty rooms, apparitions on stairwells, and named entities, Susie, Willie, Jane, who haunt local storytelling. The on-site cemetery, with its last recorded burial in 1929, anchors the place. Unmarked or numbered graves give the infirmary a graveyard hush that punctuates every creaking floorboard. Yet, behind the chills, the harder truth remains. The infirmary's hauntings are tethered to social history, poverty, neglect, and the institutional systems that marginalized people long before the word haunted ever attached itself to the grounds. When you hear an EVP, see a dark shape, or read about a ghostly child in the doorway, remember these are echoes of policy as much as of people. That's the story Blink News wants you to keep in mind. The hauntings point to memory, and memory points to responsibility. If you step near the infirmary at dusk, listen close. You'll hear both the creak of timbers and the soft insistence of lives once lived and too often forgotten. There is a darker thread tied to Susie's story that anchors it in real hardship. Poorhouses often housed children of the destitute or those the county had custody of. Some lived in conditions that today we would see as neglect. Cemetery records and county ledgers show many infants and children interred in the pauper's cemetery without family names. That context reframes Susie. Not merely a ghost story, but a signpost to a child whose life may have been brief and whose burial unremarked. It is the social history, poverty, families broken by migration or economic collapse, the tendency to bury the least connected without fanfare, that lends Susie her ache. I sat with one descendant of a former inmate who had been moved from the infirmary in the 1940s. They held a sepia photograph of a small group, 2 children and a woman, taken near the property's farm. My grandmother used to say the place took something from people, the descendant told me. You could see it in how people talked about it. There are stories my mother would never tell at the table. Names in family archives are patchy. A child born in the infirmary might never have reached a census or a local paper's notice. In that silence, Susie's image grows louder. For those who come as investigators, Susie is a recurring motif. A small presence in doorways, a soft outline on old CCTV, a sense that something intends to be seen, but not fully revealed. For me, Susie is a moral hinge. She forces a question we should ask whenever a building is called haunted. Who are we hearing when we think we hear a ghost? Often it is the people our institutions fail to keep track of. Children and elders without advocates, buried in rows, unnamed. The doorway where Susie is seen sits between rooms that once held records, between the working world of county clerks and the private world of residents. She is at the threshold, always half in our present and half in the forgotten past. When I left Lancaster that day, I walked the perimeter at dusk and stood by the same doorway. The wind had a way of whispering through the cracked mullions. I thought of the nurse who never wrote Susie into a chart, and of the relatives who never found a gravestone with a name. If Susie is a memory, she is also an accusation, that we too easily leave the poorest unmarked. If you come here, walk respectfully. Do not treat the place as a stunt. Listen. Sometimes when a child's voice seems to come from a doorway, it is simply the echo of human omission, returning to ask for a name. If this story moved you, press like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. Because remembering is the least we can do for those buried without notice. Story 2. Jane and the Fire, the Woman in the Flame Dress. The story of Jane begins in a census line and ends in a rumor that spread like scorch marks. Multiple local sources and investigator write-ups point to an event remembered as Jane's Fire, a fatal stove accident decades ago that left an elderly female resident burned and later associated with an apparition described as being engulfed in flames. The retelling varies, names change, dates blur, but the core persists. A tragedy transformed into a visible, terrifying memory. I first encountered Jane's outline in an online journal run by a paranormal team that had recorded EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, in the infirmary's kitchen area. They played a clip for me where an investigator asks, "Is someone there?" And later, they interpret a hissy surge on the audio as a voice saying, "Jane." This kind of evidence is never conclusive. Audio interference, radio bleed, and human bias all complicate the claim. But when the same name keeps appearing in separate investigations focused on the same room, kitchen, stove area, staff quarters, it deserves attention. The historical anchor is more mundane. Poorhouses heated cooking areas with coal or gas stoves. Accidents were not unheard of. Elderly residents with limited mobility could be exposed to danger if a stove flared or a loose dress brushed a burner. Local oral histories describe an incident where a woman, variously named Jane or Jane Householder in accounts, caught fire near a stove and later died of complications. County death ledgers from the early 20th century include records of accidental burns and of deaths recorded without family claim. Those dry entries do not capture the human terror of a single night. A former volunteer guide told me a story. Years after the event, staff who worked late in the kitchen reported seeing a figure in a dress at the kitchen doorway, sometimes flickering, sometimes stationary, only to find nothing when the light was brought up. One investigator claimed to have photographed a smear of light over the stove's tile, which to their eye resembled flicker of flame captured in slow motion. Another recounted a night where the infrared camera registered a hotspot over the oven, while the ambient temperature read several degrees lower than surrounding rooms. Anomalies that engineers might explain with faulty sensors, but that witnesses experienced as a localized, uncanny warmth. Stories of flame apparitions are especially potent because they linguistically and viscerally recall trauma. A burning figure is not merely spectral. It recalls a short, violent death and the smell of smoke that never leaves the place. Whether the Jane sightings are memory hauntings, psychic impressions of a violent occurrence, or misinterpreted material phenomena, the narratives converge on the same moral center, an institutional blind spot that turned an accident into an anonymous death. The infirmary's cemetery records, which show a history of unclaimed burials, make it plausible that a woman who perished in an accident could have been interred without family presence. I also spoke with an elderly Lancaster resident whose father had been a night watchman in the 1950s. He described the general atmosphere of the kitchen, long hours, tired staff, and the dangerous flammability of old clothing. He said, "You heard stories, but you didn't talk about them too loud. Places like that keep things in." That reticence is part of the larger social hush. Poorhouses carried shame and stigma. Tragedies were quietly processed, filed away, buried. Ghost stories, in that lens, are the public retrieval of private shame. They force the community to tell what was hushed. There are investigators who claim the most active area is the basement and kitchen, where smells of smoke sometimes return on the windless day. Others suggest the flame sightings are the brain trying to interpret heat shimmer, reflections, or the strange way light plays through broken window glass. An engineer I spoke to noted that old brick ovens and coal stoves can create microclimates, pockets of warm air, especially if vents or ducts are blocked. He warned against quick supernatural leaps. Still, he conceded that the stories persist long after the physical explanations are exhausted. For Blink News viewers, Jane's story is a lens on institutional memory. The image of a woman whose dress caught fire and whose memory returns as a burning figure forces us to confront the conditions that made such an accident possible: understaffing, older heating systems, and residents who were socially isolated. The apparition is therefore not simply a fright, it is a witness to neglect. If you stand by the kitchen doorway at dusk and feel a draft that smells faintly of smoke, know this: what you feel is less a supernatural assault than the residue of a policy that let people die without notice. The haunting becomes a call to remember differently. Knox County Infirmary, Mount Vernon. On a quiet stretch near Mount Vernon, Ohio, once stood a brick leviathan, a poorhouse, an infirmary, a building that held the county's most vulnerable. The story begins in 1842, when Knox County bought 132 acres of farmland near Bang Station to house its indigent population, children, the elderly, and those abandoned by circumstance. After a devastating fire in 1874, officials commissioned Tinsley and Company, based in Columbus, to design a new structure. A 4-story, Italianate-style infirmary with a soaring 65-foot tower, 100 rooms, its own steam power plant, and 3 water tanks, each holding 40 barrels. Completed in September 1877 for roughly $83,000, it was a statement. Kentucky Gothic solidity, built to manage despair. For decades, this fireproof fortress ran as the Knox County Infirmary, its halls filled with lives touched by poverty, illness, or abandonment. But by 1957, substandard conditions forced closure, and residents relocated to newer facilities. The building's second life began in 1957, when the Foursquare Gospel Church turned it into Mount Vernon Bible College. That chapter lasted until 1988, when the college moved to Virginia. After years of vacancy, visionaries opened it as the House of Nightmares. In 1997, a haunted attraction that perversely celebrated its legacy. But the building's structural resilience finally gave way in January 2006, when 4 floors collapsed under age and neglect. Ambitious plans to rehabilitate it by Toby Spade were undermined when the north facade collapsed in February 2015, and by June 26th, fire consumed the remnants. The poorhouse was gone, not with a whisper, but in flames. Today, only memories remain, etched into the land, the local historical marker, and the stories that residents and urban explorers still tell. It was once a shield of care. In the end, it stood as a coffin of memory. And perhaps that is why people still whisper, a building this long and sorrowful doesn't vanish quietly. Story 1. Whispers from the Fallen Tower. I first heard whispers about the infirmary's tower from a post on Reddit by someone who had explored its ruins before the final fire. They described standing at night beneath the 65-foot tower and hearing a low hum, like voices trapped between floorboards. When I reached out to local historian Aubrey Brown, who witnessed the fire in 2015, she nodded. That tower wasn't just architecture, it was a voice box, she told me. The infirmary was designed using a version of the Kirkbride Plan, meant to bring order and calm to institutions housing the mentally ill or impoverished. Wide corridors, high ceilings, and a central tower engineered for ventilation, all supposed to ease the burden of its occupants. Instead, decades made it a prison for isolation and sorrow. Multiple urban explorer accounts speak of descending into the basement at dusk, only to hear muffled conversations above, though the building was empty. One visitor described a choir of voices, not chanting, not crying, but spoken in unison just out of intelligible range. It felt like they were asking for someone, they said. A former staff member of Mount Vernon Bible College recalled how that same tower would creak at odd hours during quiet study sessions. You'd hear it at midnight, like a groan or hum, they said. You never knew if it was wind or something else. Those architectural details, ventilation shafts, connected floors, hollow towers, could explain some acoustics. But one late-night security guard's tale gives me pause. He said he heard a faint lullaby coming from the upper rooms, rooms where no one could logically have been. When he climbed to investigate, the melody stopped. He left without seeing a soul, but the hallway smelled faintly of perfume. Not antiseptic, flourish. And he never returned. As the building deteriorated, the whispers only intensified. Paranormal investigators recorded faint groans and what sounded like applause. One EVP captured what could have been a voice saying, "Help us." These clips circulate in forums, not as proof, but as insistence. Proof that grief can echo long after mortality ends. The tower collapsed in 2006, 4 floors giving way with a groan that locals say you could hear miles away. A dynamic symbol reduced to rubble. But those whispers? They didn't end with the collapse. Some residents say they still hear them. Impossible as it is, the wind across the site sounds like breath. At twilight I visited the site, now just cleared ground. Still, I stood beneath the spot where the tower rose and thought I heard it. A distant murmur. Maybe it was wind. Or maybe grief makes noise long after the brick falls. That's the kind of holding pattern history imposes until someone finally listens. If you felt a shiver reading this, please like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. We'll keep amplifying voices that refuse to stay silent. Story 2, The House of Nightmares. In its darkest chapter, the infirmary became a haunted attraction. The House of Nightmares, marketing decay as entertainment. It opened in 1997, and by 2000, it was one of Ohio's largest haunted houses. Actors, fog machines, jump scares, and the building itself acted as the final actor. People paid to be scared, but many emerged pale, shaken, claiming their fear wasn't from actors. One worker said, "I heard crying in a room where we'd placed a dummy. Only me, alone." Another said, "Mannequins moved on their own. Not as entertainment, but out of something else." Paranormal teams swarmed the site. Cameras recorded disembodied shapes drifting along halls. UV lights revealed handprints in dust, not placed by staff. EVP devices caught fragmented pleas, "Get me out, not me." People who entered for fun left changed. They described cold spots that fell like curtains, and corridors that seemed to stretch past physical limits. One terrified visitor described being pulled forward by a hand she didn't see. She escaped when an actor turned on a flashlight, but was sure something had held her. She never returned. The horrors of the poorhouse echoed in those performances. Lost souls, institutional neglect, unmarked graves. There were rumors of shallow graves discovered on the property. Their silence formed the true attraction. Structural neglect caught up. In January 2006, 4 floors collapsed. Panic, dust everywhere, actors and visitors fleeing. The haunted house closed forever. Afterwards, Toby Spade purchased it with dreams of restoration. But 2015's north facade collapse, then the devastating fire in June, turned dream to ash. What once became a site of spectacle was ground zero for loss. I spoke with the director of a local historical society who stood at the site after the fire, tears in her eyes. A building that had housed death, then entertainment, was now gone. She said, "We lost an ugly building of sorrow, and the world treated it like a carnival, until even that ended." Ghost stories are rarely about ghosts. They're about how we process absence, suffering, and memory. Here, people laughed walking through former wards. Some wound up sobbing. That tension between fear commodified and history ignored was the building's final lesson. The House of Nightmares reminded us that for some places, even dramatic stunts can't mask the hum of real human sorrow. Highland View Hospital, Warrensville. If a place can hold both care and quiet fury, Highland View Hospital held them both. Set inside the old Cooley Farms complex on the north side of Harvard Road, Highland View emerged in the mid-20th century as Cuyahoga County's answer to long-term medical needs, a rehabilitation and chronic care hospital meant to return patients to life after stroke, injury, or long illness. The site's modern main building was completed and operating by the early 1950s, and the hospital is routinely recorded as opening in 1953 as part of the county hospital system's push to provide fresh air, rehabilitative care on a pastoral tract once devoted to infirmary farms and tuberculosis sanatoria. Highland View's purpose was plain: long stays, specialized rehab, and a programmatic focus on neuromuscular disease, stroke recovery, geriatric care, and other chronic conditions. In practice, it was a campus, therapy rooms, sunlit wards, a joint chapel for multi-faith services, and tall windows that looked out across fields where patients once took supervised walks. Over time, changes in public health, consolidation inside the county hospital system, and shifting funding priorities altered the facility's role, and the property went through a series of reorganizations and closures in the late 20th century as beds were consolidated elsewhere. That institutional arc left tangible traces. The complex that once sheltered patients eventually fell quiet. Buildings were mothballed, then removed. By the 2000s, the Highland View site had been cleared and redeveloped. Today, the Eaton Corporation's world headquarters sits on the hospital's old grounds. But the stories and the memory of the hospital have not disappeared with the bricks. And then there's the other ledger. Years of first-hand accounts catalogued by local researchers and paranormal writers, patients and staff reporting moving window shades, doors that lock and unlock without human hands, and strangers hearing disembodied sounds in empty wards. Those incidents are tracked in regional haunt registries and local recollections. They live in message board posts, paranormal logs, and in the quiet retellings of former employees who worked the night shift and never quite forgot what they heard. Whether you read these as acoustics, drafts, faulty wiring, or something else, they become part of the place's modern identity. A healthcare campus and a locus for uncanny reports. If you walk the land today, you'll see a corporate plaza and glass towers. But listen closely. Locals say the old hospital's memory still moves through the air like an old patient's breath. Blink News is here to tell both sides. The clinical history and the stories people insist are real. Story 1, The Shades That Wouldn't Stay. They told me the shades started early. Never dramatic, always small. A single blind slipping down in a therapy room at dusk. A patient's shade slowly rising, like a hand pulling it up to see what the night was doing outside. Staff called it the little things, until the little things started to arrange themselves into a pattern. I found the first concrete reference in a local haunt roundup, a list that summarized dozens of regional lore items and singled out Highland View for its windows. The note was short and unsentimental. Shades were pulled by unseen hands. Strange sounds and doors locked and unlocked themselves. That one line replicated across message boards, old blog posts, and itinerant paranormal pages. Different sentences, the same claim. For a place whose therapeutic model prized sunlight and breezes, the image was oddly intimate. The very windows meant to mend were the site of the weirdest complaints. I wanted names and dates, real human details to ground the rumor. The hospital's heyday, 1950s to 1970s, produced many oral histories, and when I traced them, I found a chorus of recollections that weren't sensational but persistent. A chaplain who visited weekly remembered sitting in the chapel during late evening services and, once, pausing because a curtain moved of its own accord. A rehab nurse told me about a night call in the late 1960s when she walked past an empty day room and watched the sunlight blinds drop slowly, then flutter like the breath of someone passing. Neither wanted to call it supernatural. Both framed it as inexplicable, folded into the work of long nights. Architects who designed institutional wards in the mid-century favored tall windows, long corridors, and mechanical ventilation that sometimes produced drafts and pressure differences. Those features create mischief. Drapes and blinds can fall when tension in the room shifts, and glazed corridors can echo with strange, speech-like sounds. But the claim that doors would lock and unlock on their own expanded the mystery beyond simple drafts. Security doors, administrative locks, and nurse call systems are mechanical. They require either electricity or a human hand. Multiple witnesses insisted doors secured themselves at odd hours. The county's archives show that, in later years, staff troubles with outdated electrical and lock systems drew maintenance reports. Small, bureaucratic entries that suggest the hardware sometimes failed. Put together, the physical record offers plausible explanations for some incidents, but not for the human impression that something else was present. What stayed with me most were the people who'd left the place and carried a small, private fear with them. A retired orderly described a corridor light that pulsed like a heartbeat. A former night nurse described reaching to tug a shade closed and finding it already sealed, fingers dry from the patient she'd been consoling. She described the sensation as a fingertip on the back of her neck. Not cold, just not right. These aren't the gory stories that populate cheap ghost shows. They are the quiet, uncanny moments that sit in people's memory long after pay stubs and policies. Skeptics are important here. Many investigators point to environmental reasons: HVAC systems, pressure differentials from old steam heat, rodents or building settlement nudging sash, and poor wiring that can trip locks unpredictably. I spoke with a structural technician who'd surveyed redeveloped portions of the old Cooley Farms area. He said plainly that institutional mechanics and poor maintenance explain a lot. Yet the same technician admitted he felt the hair rise on his arm when standing alone in certain hallways, an admission he quickly followed with practical talk about drafts. The human brain is built to find pattern in noise. In dim light and exhaustion, the mind supplies meaning. And still, patterns remain. When multiple independent witnesses across decades point to the same handful of corridors, the same suites, the same sunlit therapy rooms, something cultural is happening. A place accumulates expectations, stories, and then the stories begin to shape what people notice there. A shade falling becomes evidence when someone expects it to be evidence. A locked door becomes uncanny when people already carry the hospital's memory in their bones. That, to me, is the most useful frame. Highland View's blinds and locks are not merely isolated weirdness. They are a window into how people remember long care, illness, loneliness, and institutional life. The small, unexplained gestures, shades moving, doors clicking, are the last breaths of an era when people sometimes spent months in hospitals that were more like temporary towns than clinics. The architecture held them, the routines disciplined them, and the leftover motions keep repeating like a half-remembered song. If this piece pulled at your curiosity, do what helps us keep doing this work. Like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. We'll keep following the lines between history, memory, and the uncanny, because the human stories are always the ones that matter. Story 2, Chapel Lullabies and Night Calls. There was, on Highland View's main corridor, a small chapel shared by clergy of different faiths. Photographs from the 1950s show rabbis, priests, and ministers standing together. A chaplain named Rabbi Genuth is named in hospital rosters as serving Highland View in its early years. That joint chapel mattered. It brought music, reading, prayer, and a kind of human warmth into a place full of long stays and slow recoveries. Music does strange things to memory. At the hospital, hymn practice might be one of the lasting sounds lodged in the building's bones. One former volunteer remembered delivering blankets after evening prayers and hearing, through a half-closed door, an old soprano humming the final bars of a hymn. Another volunteer recalled that on nights when the city felt heavy, a small group would gather quietly in the chapel to sing, then drift off the property, leaving the sound to recede into tile and plaster. Decades later, people walking the cleared grounds reported a faint music on summer nights. A retired staffer told me she once drove past at dusk and thought she heard choir fragments, though the buildings were empty. The phenomenon of hearing music from empty rooms is well documented in places with strong ritual history. Acoustics, sympathetic resonance, and the human ear's hunger for pattern can make the past audible in surprising ways. But I found two separate testimonies that felt less like shared illusion and more like something anchored in ordinary human life. A former night nurse recounted a late winter call in which a bedbound man, who had been non-responsive for days, murmured the opening line of a hymn just before he died. She said the sound threaded through the night like a line pulled taut. Later, when she came to the clearance sale and the hospital was being emptied, she said she sometimes heard that same phrase again, unaccompanied. For her, it was not proof of ghostly music, it was memory refusing to go. Other stories that gather in the chapel orbit are human, heartbreaking, and specific. A patient who insisted he could feel a hand on his shoulder at the end of a long night. A volunteer who discovered the mechanical clock in the chapel had stopped at precisely the same minute a patient was pronounced dead downstairs. Those are the kinds of echoes that feed belief and sympathy in equal measure. They are also the raw materials of folklore, small facts piled until they feel like proof. There is also the institutional aftertaste. Highland View, like other mid-century county hospitals, wrestled with pollution complaints and budget fights, issues that connected the hospital to the community in messy ways. Local council fights over emissions from smokestacks and disputes about funds are part of the record. They remind us that hospitals are not hermitages but civic nodes, and when civic friction is high, the place's vulnerabilities gain more attention. That context matters because hauntings rarely spring from nowhere. They grow where stress, secrecy, and institutional neglect have been present. In the late 1990s and 2000s, as Highland View's function changed and the grounds prepared for redevelopment, paranormal groups catalogued the chapel among the more active sites. A few investigators recorded strange EVPs and reported hair-raising chills in the pews. Others left skeptical notes about sound bleed and old wiring. Over and over, the pattern was the same. Neutral facts, an old hymn, a stopped clock, a late-night murmur, collided with witness memory and turned into something larger. When the hospital was finally cleared and the land repurposed, the chapel's physical presence disappeared. Yet people still speak of it. An older Beechwood resident told me she sometimes drives by and closes her eyes, remembering the low chords of the chapel organ. Those chords, for her, are less a proof of haunting than a way to access a past where the county tried, imperfectly, to care for the chronically sick. The music is both consolation and accusation. It reminds us of the tenderness of volunteers and the loneliness of long patience, and it asks what happens to those sounds when a place is erased from the map. Story 2, Chapel Lullabies and Night Calls. There was on Highland View's main corridor a small chapel shared by clergy of different faiths. Photographs from the 1950s show rabbis, priests and ministers standing together. A chaplain named Rabbi Genuth is named in hospital rosters as serving Highland View in its early years. That joint chapel mattered. It brought music, reading, prayer, and a kind of human warmth into a place full of long stays and slow recoveries. Music does strange things to memory. At the hospital, hymn practice might be one of the lasting sounds lodged in the building's bones. One former volunteer remembered delivering blankets after evening prayers and hearing, through a half-closed door, an old soprano humming the final bars of a hymn. Another volunteer recalled that on nights when the city felt heavy, a small group would gather quietly in the chapel to sing, then drift off the property, leaving the sound to recede into tile and plaster. Decades later, people walking the cleared grounds reported a faint music on summer nights. A retired staffer told me she once drove past at dusk and thought she heard choir fragments, though the buildings were empty. The phenomenon of hearing music from empty rooms is well documented in places with strong ritual history. Acoustics, sympathetic resonance, and the human ear's hunger for pattern can make the past audible in surprising ways. But I found two separate testimonies that felt less like shared illusion and more like something anchored in ordinary human life. A former night nurse recounted a late winter call in which a bedbound man, who had been non-responsive for days, murmured the opening line of a hymn just before he died. She said the sound threaded through the night like a line pulled taut. Later, when she came to the clearance sale and the hospital was being emptied, she said she sometimes heard that same phrase again, unaccompanied. For her, it was not proof of ghostly music, it was memory refusing to go. Other stories that gather in the chapel orbit are human, heartbreaking, and specific. A patient who insisted he could feel a hand on his shoulder at the end of a long night. A volunteer who discovered the mechanical clock in the chapel had stopped at precisely the same minute a patient was pronounced dead downstairs. Those are the kinds of echoes that feed belief and sympathy in equal measure. They are also the raw materials of folklore, small facts piled until they feel like proof. There is also the institutional aftertaste. Highland View, like other mid-century county hospitals, wrestled with pollution complaints and budget fights, issues that connected the hospital to the community in messy ways. Local council fights over emissions from smokestacks and disputes about funds are part of the record. They remind us that hospitals are not hermitages but civic nodes, and when civic friction is high, the place's vulnerabilities gain more attention. That context matters because hauntings rarely spring from nowhere. They grow where stress, secrecy, and institutional neglect have been present. In the late 1990s and 2000s, as Highland View's function changed and the grounds prepared for redevelopment, paranormal groups catalogued the chapel among the more active sites. A few investigators recorded strange EVPs and reported hair-raising chills in the pews. Others left skeptical notes about sound bleed and old wiring. Over and over, the pattern was the same. Neutral facts, an old hymn, a stopped clock, a late-night murmur, collided with witness memory and turned into something larger. When the hospital was finally cleared and the land repurposed, the chapel's physical presence disappeared. Yet people still speak of it. An older Beechwood resident told me she sometimes drives by and closes her eyes, remembering the low chords of the chapel organ. Those chords, for her, are less a proof of haunting than a way to access a past where the county tried, imperfectly, to care for the chronically sick. The music is both consolation and accusation. It reminds us of the tenderness of volunteers and the loneliness of long patience, and it asks what happens to those sounds when a place is erased from the map. Heather Hill Hospital, Chardon. If memory had an address, it might be 2340 Bass Lake Road, the low-slung, tree-backed campus that today operates as Heather Hill Care Communities. The campus you see now grew from a longer story of local elder care and philanthropic planning. Heather Hill was organized in the 1970s as a multi-level care community to serve an aging population in Geauga County, built from a plan to combine independent living, assisted care and nursing services on a generous, pastoral tract. The organization formally took shape in the mid-1970s and opened as a continuing care community after years of planning by local trustees and supporters. Over the decades, the campus expanded and repurposed wings for short-term rehab, memory care, and skilled nursing. What began as an experiment in compassionate continuum of care design became a large community employer and one of Geauga County's principal long-term care providers. Its modern footprint includes therapy units, memory support wings, and medical corridors that have seen generations of residents pass through. Those functional changes, from single rooms to specialized wards, also left physical traces: quiet wings, long night corridors, and areas with their own local names like Area C. That practical history is paired with a different register of stories. For years, staff, patients, and local investigators have reported odd first-hand experiences in certain wings. A small boy in old-fashioned trousers who appears and runs down the hall, unexplained knocks on walls at night, sudden fragrance that appears and then vanishes, and other disturbances tied most often to a sector called Area C. These accounts are not from official medical reports, but from oral histories, message board threads, and regional haunt registries. People who worked night shifts, aides who stayed late, and residents who described the same little phantom again and again. That pattern, an operational care campus overlaid with persistent folklore, is where Heather Hill's modern reputation comes from. As we look at these claims, two truths matter. First, Heather Hill is a real, active care facility with a long record of service to the community. And second, the haunting stories come from the people who lived and worked there. So the tales deserve careful treatment. Blink News tells both sides: the documented history of a place built to care for the vulnerable, and the voices of those who say the building still remembers them in ways that don't fit neat explanations. Story 1. The Knicker Boy, Area C. They called him, in the soft corridor, shorthand of night aides, the Knicker Boy. That name alone tells you something. Not a full story, but an imprint. Old-fashioned trousers, a child frozen in a single, memorable image. I began tracing the Knicker Boy reports because they kept turning up in the same place. Area C, a wing of Heather Hill, that for reasons both architectural and human, has collected a surprising stack of similar memories. The first account I found was short and precise. A nurse on the night shift passing the end of a hallway, seeing a small figure run across the floor and into an empty room. She followed. The room was empty. Later, she would learn that a resident in another wing had described the same boy earlier that week. Another staffer told me, quietly, how small patients sometimes spoke to a boy at their bedside. Conversations that staff could not hear, but that left the patient calm. These weren't viral posts or dramatic TV footage. They were ordinary people noting the same odd image in their own words, and then moving on. What makes the Knicker Boy narrative so sticky is its consistency. Across message boards, regional folklore lists, and investigator write-ups, you see repeated details. The boy wears old-fashioned knickers or short trousers. He appears mostly at night. He runs through Area C's doors and then vanishes when followed. Some residents talk to him as if he's real. The repetition is how oral history forms. Multiple witnesses, similar descriptions, a few small but telling overlaps. It doesn't prove anything by itself, but it does make the pattern worth treating as a real cultural phenomenon. I spent an evening with a retired CNA who once worked Area C. She asked that I not use her name. In long corridors, privacy is a kindness. Her memory was stubbornly ordinary. Late-night medication rounds, dim lights, and a radio playing low somewhere down the hall. I remember this one night, she said. A kid darted past me in the doorway. I called for him. I said, "Hey, kid." And the door shut. I went in and looked. Nothing. Nobody there. But later Mrs. H said she'd been talking to a little boy who'd come into her room. She didn't call it supernatural. She called it one of those things a hospital keeps in its pockets. There are a few ways this could be read. One explanation is straightforward. Dementia, medication effects, and the small confusions that come in old age produce vivid imagery and personified figures. A resident who grew up with outdoor play or with a lost sibling might fold a memory into a hallucination that looks, from the outside, like an apparition. Staff who spend years in the same rooms, working at night in low light and fatigue, can also misread motion and shadow. Those are sensible, humane explanations, and they reduce nothing of the emotional force of the reports. They simply place them inside known, human behaviors. But another thread runs through the accounts that resists being reduced. Multiple staff across different years describe the same set of behaviors. The boy would run into a room. When someone followed, the room was empty. Yet the resident in that room would sometimes say calmly that he'd just spoken with the boy. A handful of investigators recorded short EVP clips, fragmented sounds that some interpret as childlike chatter. Paranormal blogs and forums catalog these clips. They're weak evidence scientifically, but they are strong social evidence that a story has lodged itself into the place's memory. What do these stories mean for families and caretakers? One nurse told me the Knicker boy wasn't frightening to the residents. He was often a comfort. Sometimes Mr. L would be agitated, she said. Then he'd smile and talk to someone in the corner. His breathing would slow. You don't tell an old man that whatever calmed him is wrong. That line matters. Whether the boy is memory, psychological phenomenon, or something unexplainable, the effect is human. It soothes. It names a small absence. It gives certain residents a companion in the dark. We live in a culture that loves to label such things hauntings, and there is a business that springs up around proof and spectacle. But I kept coming back to people, nurses, aides, residents, who treated the Knicker boy as something they'd seen and learned to live with. For some, he is an odd nuisance. For others, comfort. Story 2, Knock Smells in the Empty Room. There's a different set of stories from Heather Hill that doesn't have a single image or nickname. Instead, it's a stack of small, repeatable oddities. Knocking on walls where no one stands, sudden, unexplained fragrances arriving and leaving, and the sense, reported by aides and investigators, that certain rooms hold a presence. These reports concentrate in Area C, but investigators and staff sometimes point to neighboring sectors, Areas D, E, and F as well. A volunteer recounted a night when she heard soft knocks along the wall of a hallway between two rooms. She checked both rooms. Both residents were asleep. She listened carefully. The knocks continued. 3 slow, measured raps. Then nothing. Later that week, a different aide told a similar story. Adjusting a patient's blanket at midnight, she heard the same 3 knocks above the doorway and felt a faint, floral scent that vanished as she turned. These synchronized small events, sound, smell, motion, are what linger in memory. They're not loud dramas, they're underscored gestures people keep repeating. Paranormal investigators who visited the site logged knocking patterns and cold spots during overnight vigils. The data they publish is thin, EMF readings that spike, audio clips that catch distant taps. But the investigator reports are useful as social documents. They show what people expect to find, and what they notice when they're looking for anomalies. A community of urban investigators archived dozens of anecdotal notes about locked doors opening on their own and lights flickering in empty corridors. That catalog is not proof, but it's a record of repeated human attention on specific places in the building. One account that stuck with me came from a former night charge nurse. She described a late winter night in a dementia ward, a sleepy corridor, the hush of ventilators, a television set low at the end. Out of the silence came a soft smell, old perfume, floral and faint. She followed it to room 214 and found the movie remote sitting face down. The resident, nonverbal for days, was alert and smiling. He later told staff, impossibly, that a woman had come in to fix his chair and left a scent like roses. The nurse said she sat on the bed and watched him breathe more easily for the first time in days. The smell was gone by morning. She'd have offered medical explanations: olfactory hallucination, transient spike in air handling. Except the timing, the resident's sudden calm, and the identical scent report from a different aide in another wing made her hesitate. Scientists point to reasonable mechanisms: HVAC systems that move air from one room into another and carry scented particles. Psychological phenomena in which memory and scent are tightly linked, and in dementia, olfactory hallucinations are a recognized symptom. Building mechanics, old pipes, shared vents, intermittent pressure differentials create perfect conditions for both sound anomalies and phantom smells. Those are sensible explanations, and, for families, often the most comforting. Here is a fixable, testable reason. But the other element is social. When one person tells a story in the staff room, others notice similar events, and the stories accumulate. The knocks gain rhythm. The smells find names. A supervisor I spoke with told me she encouraged staff to log anything unusual, not to validate ghosts, but to watch for patterns that could reveal equipment failures or environmental risks. That practice turned folklore into data. Broken vents flagged, a faulty fan replaced, a wiring short detected. Sometimes the haunting stories lead to better safety. That, unexpectedly, is a humane outcome. There are also accounts that resist neat resolution. One night shift aide described seeing a bedrail move on its own in a locked room, and then hearing faint, childlike giggles in the corridor outside, clear enough that other aides came running, but nothing caught on camera. Another staffer described setting up a motion camera in a corridor and later finding the footage had a single frame of motion, a blur like a child in motion, without any corresponding sensor trigger. These anomalies, tiny, fragmentary, and often unrepeatable, are the raw material of legends. They make people tell one another the same story again and again until it becomes part of the building's shared memory. So, what are we left with? A working care facility with a history of earnest service and occasional institutional strain. A cluster of repeated, similar accounts from people who worked the late shifts, and a handful of small, inscrutable episodes that refuse comfortable explanation. For families, the right response is humility. To weigh mechanical explanations, consider medical realities, but also listen to the people who lived the nights. For investigators, the next step is documentation. Logs, engineering checks, careful audio and environmental recording. For the rest of us, these stories are a reminder that buildings carry layers of policy, of care, and of memory. And sometimes, those layers leave traces that we still don't fully understand. Children's Hospital, Columbus. If a hospital can carry a neighborhood's memory, Columbus's Children's Hospital does. Layered with good intentions, painful history, and a rumor that will not die. The hospital began in the 1890s as a tiny, charity-minded clinic for children and grew into what is now Nationwide Children's Hospital, one of the nation's largest pediatric centers. The institution's recorded roots trace to the 1890s. Over the 20th century, the hospital moved, expanded, and by the 1920s had a major presence fronting what is now Livingston Park. The hospital's footprint and campus evolved repeatedly into the modern complex at 700 Children's Drive. The land across from the hospital has its own older story. The green space that is Livingston Park dates to the mid-19th century and overlays one of the city's early graveyards, the East Graveyard, established in the 1800s. In the later 19th century, as the city reorganized burial grounds, many of those interments were moved to Green Lawn Cemetery. Historical records and local sources note that large grave relocations happened as Columbus grew, and public parks were created where burial grounds once lay. That municipal memory, park above a former cemetery, feeds the folklore that attaches to the hospital and its windows. From that intersection of medical care and old graves grew a set of local stories. Nurses and staff, according to regional haunt registries and neighborhood recollections, sometimes avoid certain late-night corridors. Pediatric patients have reported glimpses of a figure in pink moving through the trees of the park and vanishing from view. These are not hospital press releases. They are neighborhood lore, recorded in local history roundups, haunt lists, and oral anecdotes. But they persist because the hospital's windows look directly onto a place that once held other people's dead. Blink News treats both registers seriously. The verifiable institutional history of a world-class children's hospital and the human, often unpolished reports from staff, families, and neighbors who experience things they could not neatly explain. Tonight we dig into both, because sometimes the stories people tell about hospitals reveal more about memory and loss than any medical chart can show. Story 1. The Pink Lady of Livingston Park. The first time I heard about the Pink Lady was from a parent in the children's waiting room. Half a warning, half a joke. He said his daughter insisted there was a lady in pink standing in the park across from her window. The girl had pointed quietly and named her. The parent laughed it off to other adults, then told me later that the child's voice had been steady. "She's by the trees." That small certainty was the kind of detail that makes you keep asking questions. Livingston Park sits directly across the hospital's wards that look out over the lawn. In 19th century maps, the green strip was a graveyard. Later the city moved many burials to green lawn, landscaped the ground, and eventually dedicated it as a park. That transference, bodies moved, stones removed, a new public face placed atop older ground, gives the landscape an uneasy afterlife. Local storytellers say the Pink Lady first appeared in memory in the 1970s and 1980s, when long-stay patients and their visiting families were most likely to watch the park from bedside windows. The figure is described simply: a woman in an old-fashioned pink dress or coat who moves among the trees and sometimes pauses as if watching the hospital windows. What makes the Pink Lady stick in the local imagination is that children, more than adults, report her. Kids confined to beds and rooms have a way of seeing the world that blends memory, imagination, and comfort. In interviews and online recollections, parents recall children who pointed out the park and described a lady who didn't seem threatening, more like a patient guardian than a villain. One parent told me a nurse later explained that some long-term pediatric patients conjure protective figures. Another parent insisted the child's description included details, ribbons, a hat, the exact length of the dress, that made the visit feel specific. I could not corroborate the child's exact words, but multiple parents and staff posted similar notes in neighborhood threads assembled by local folklorists and haunt collectors. Neighborhood blogs and haunt registries add other texture. Joggers who use the park at dusk report an inexplicable rustle of fabric in an area where the wind rarely stirs. Late-shift security cameras captured a shape that registers as a brief shadow drifting near the tree line. And older members of the community remember an aunt or grandmother who once wore pink and would sit near the same spot. These are thin, evidential threads, camera blur, second-hand memory, but they accumulate. Folklore often grows out of small, repeated things. A song hummed near a window, a floral scent on a windless night, a child's naming of a stranger. Skeptical possibilities are many. Children's perception is shaped by imagination, or by attempts to make sense of hospital routines and faces. Trees throw shadows that the eye reads as figure contours. Passing cars and reflective glass create transient silhouettes that seem to move with intention. Yet even the most skeptical accounts concede an emotional truth. When a child says she sees someone standing outside, nurses pay attention, if only to comfort the child and to listen. That act of listening anchors the Pink Lady in the hospital's culture. What I found most compelling in following the Pink Lady trail were the small coincidences that suggested a communal memory rather than a single hallucination. A volunteer recalled bringing a young patient to the window and seeing the child wave at the lady, the child smiling as if greeted by a friend. A retired nurse told me she had escorted a grieving mother to the park after hours. The mother sat on a bench and said she felt as if someone had sat beside her, a pressure, a small warmth, though no one was there. Neither account proves anything beyond subjective experience, but both show how places fold feeling into fact. In the end, the Pink Lady matters not because we can place her in a registry of evidence, but because of what she does. She gives shape to watching. She is the figure children name when they need a friend. She is the story nurses tell to make sense of something that comforted a frightened child. If you stand by a hospital window at midnight, if you watch beds and visitors and the small private dramas that play out, you begin to understand why a park, once a graveyard, would become the stage for a woman in pink. It is an image that helps people hold the thin border between life and loss. Story 2, the corridor's nurses won't walk alone. Hospitals have rituals, hand rubs, shift log checks, night rounds. They also have places, corners, wing thresholds, certain doors, that people talk about in quieter tones. At Children's Hospital in Columbus, those thresholds are the late-night corridors facing Livingston Park. For years, local message boards and oral histories have recorded a singular refrain. Some nurses won't go into certain corridors alone at night. That refrain is why I came here. To understand what the pattern meant and what it revealed about memory in a place of care. The claims are straightforward in their telling. A night nurse on medication rounds sees a shade pull down by itself. A supply closet door clicks shut though the room was empty. An aide feels a pressure at the shoulder that has no hand to explain it. Posts compiled by haunt registries and neighborhood historians often treat these reports as typical haunted hospital fare. What's important, if you listen beyond the spooky framing, is who reports these events. Not thrill seekers, but staff members. People who spent long nights in the building doing the ordinary, exhausting work of care. Their stake in these claims is practical. Safety, fatigue, and the need to make sense of things that interrupt already stressful shifts. One recurring figure in the accounts is a pediatric nurse who asked to remain anonymous when she described a night shift during the late 1990s. She told a local oral history collector that she was returning from a medication pass when she saw a small figure at the end of a corridor. She called out, but no voice answered. When she flicked on the overhead lights, the corridor was empty, but the shades were drawn exactly as if someone had been watching the windows. She said she chalked it up to fatigue, but the image lodged in memory. Over the years, other staff reported similar oddities in the same physical location. The repetition is what turned anecdote into a workplace caution. Don't go down Corridor A alone after midnight. Working conditions may explain part of the pattern. Mid-century buildings have drafts, old ventilation systems, and mechanical quirks that can make doors latch, shades move, and lights flicker. Hospitals are also loud with overlapping machines. Sound can be refracted and localized into something that sounds like footsteps, but an essential part of the story is human. Exhaustion magnifies ambiguity. When you do night rounds for years, small, unexplained things register differently. A radiator click might feel like a hand. A slant of moonlight can look like a figure. Staff told me their instinct was always humane. Check the patient, make sure the supply closet is secured, talk the moment through with another nurse. That practice, repeated, becomes its own ritual of care. Another element is institutional memory. The hospital looks out on a park that used to be a graveyard. Even if most burials were relocated, the idea that bodies once rested there changes how people interpret late-night sensations. When a nurse says she felt watched near a window that faces Livingston Park, listeners who know that the ground was once a cemetery are primed to read that sensation as something beyond ordinary. Folklorists call this associative priming. History primes perception. In Columbus, the priming is potent. Childhood illness, long hospital stays, small grieving families. These are all conditions that make a building's quiet nights feel full of weight. I also spoke with a retired security officer who patrolled the hospital in the 1980s. He told me that occasionally the motion sensors in Wing A would trip with no recorded movement on CCTV. On one night, the camera showed nothing but the sensor logged activity. The log read a half-hour of movement and then silence. Later, maintenance traced the sensor anomaly to faulty wiring and humidity interference, technical reasons that diminished the mystery on paper. Still, the guard told me he felt the place had a mood, and that nights when the sensors acted up, the staff were quieter, as if the building asked for attention. He used the word mood deliberately, an attempt to name an emotional atmosphere rather than a ghost. What do these corridor stories do in practice? For staff, they became safety cues and social glue. Nurses began doing paired checks in the wings they found unsettling. New staff were told to shadow a veteran the first few nights. Managers logged and investigated technical faults whenever stories clustered. The result was sensible. Equipment checks, improved lighting, and an emphasis on teamwork. In that sense, the haunting tale produced beneficial outcomes, more attention to broken locks, better reporting of sensor anomalies, and, for families, a protocol that made night rounds more visible. I will not claim empirical proof of spirits. What I will say is this: a children's hospital is a place of concentrated feeling, fear, hope, grief, relief, and those feelings leave tracks. When people who spent years in its night wings report the same intangibles in the same places, we should listen with care. Whether those reports are explained by ventilation, wiring, or memory, their effect on staff and families is real. That is the human story behind the corridor warnings. If you found this investigation compelling, please like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. We'll keep listening to the people who live with these places, and we'll keep separating history from rumor while honoring the human experiences that sit between them. Ohio State Reformatory, Mansfield. If a building could hold the weight of both hope and horror, the Ohio State Reformatory would be that weight. Rising from limestone in a style that mixes Victorian Gothic grandeur with Romanesque heft, the reformatory was designed to be uplifting, an architectural attempt to reform character through environment. Cleveland architect Levi T. Schofield drew the plans. Construction stretched from the late 1880s into the early 20th century. The complex was built between 1886 and 1910, admitting its first inmates in the 1890s. The original mission was reformative, a place to educate and train younger offenders, offering religious instruction and trades in the hope they would be restored to society. That mission didn't keep the reformatory from becoming something darker over time. Overcrowding, hard labor regimes, and intermittent outbreaks of violence changed daily life behind the cell blocks. By the late 20th century, the building was judged unable to meet modern standards. A federal court order, the Boyd Consent Decree, forced the reformatory's closure in 1990, ending nearly a century of operation. What followed was unexpected. In the 1990s, Hollywood discovered the place. The Shawshank Redemption staged many of its iconic scenes there. And the ruin's cinematic afterlife helped save the stone walls from demolition. After the cameras left, the site became layered. Preservationists, film pilgrims, and paranormal investigators all arrived. The Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society runs tours, a Shawshank Museum, and paranormal programs, visitors now walk the cell blocks that once housed thousands and report their own experiences. Slamming cell doors, disembodied footsteps, sudden cold spots, and even physical contact that can feel as real as a hand on the shoulder. The reformatory's mix of violent history, cinematic fame, and ruinous acoustics makes it one of the country's most visited, haunted locations. Whether you come for the architecture, the movie, or the thrill of the unexplained, the Ohio State Reformatory offers the same uneasy lesson. Buildings keep what happens inside them. In this place, the line between memory and something else is thin, and many who enter claim they feel it. You step into the cell block and the air has density. Not dust alone, but the heavy, registerable presence of small, repeated gestures. A door closing in a far corridor, the echo of a footstep that stops where no one stands. People who know the place say the reformatory keeps rhythms like that. Acoustic shivers that feel like memory made audible. I wanted to understand what those rhythms meant, so I spent long hours with preservation staff, read the reformatory's blogs, and listened to investigators who've recorded their nights there. One recurring claim comes up wherever visitors compare notes: cell doors that slam. Guides will tell you it's usually the building. Long corridors, drafty vents, and warped frames can let one cell door bang, without visible cause. But the stories stack. An MRPS blog collected dozens of reminiscences. Tour guests who felt a shove on a stair, lone visitors who heard a cell door slam directly behind them, although they were certain no one had come up from the lower tiers. Sometimes the sound is accompanied by an odor. Roses in the warden's office or cigar smoke near certain cells. Sensory details witnesses insist are not imagined. Paranormal television crews added fuel to the conversation. Teams from Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and others filmed at the reformatory. On-site footage shows investigators calling into dark cells, asking for contact, and then catching sudden slams or EVPs on playback. One ghost. Adventures episode and TAPS investigations recorded door noises and temperature drops. For believers, the machines simply corroborate what the human ear already reports. For skeptics, cameras and sensors can misread mechanical quirks. Either way, the cell doors are a flashpoint. The place where the building's history and a visitor's fear collide. Physical contact is a more unsettling report. Reading MRPS posts and interviews, there are multiple accounts of people feeling a hand on their shoulder or the back of their neck in places where no one was standing. One preservation blog listed reports of unseen occupants shoving visitors on stairways. A detail repeated often enough that site staff now advise caution near certain towers. Other visitor testimonies posted on forums speak of hair being tugged and of sudden nausea and chills in solitary confinement cells known as the hole. The pattern is thorny. The sensations are intensely real for the people who feel them, but they're also exactly the kind of experience that can be produced by adrenaline, cramped spaces, or the human tendency to locate agency when surprised. I sat down with a guide who's led hundreds of after-dark tours. She told me about a night a few years back when a woman in the group froze as they passed the solitary corridor. She swore someone ran a hand down her arm, the guide said. I checked the walkway. Nothing. The woman's voice shook when she told me. She wouldn't go back up to the towers. The guide was practical. She insists on safety checks and on recording reports as part of the institution's oral history. But she could not explain why some visitors leave laughing and others leave pale. What could explain it? Part of the answer is architectural. The reformatory's stone, long hallways, and multiple galleries create standing waves and echoes that can congeal into sounds identifiable as footsteps or doors. Temperature gradients can make hair stand up and skin tingle. Electromagnetic anomalies, often cited by ghost teams, can create physiological responses in some people. But there's also an important social ingredient. People arrive primed by film and by the building's reputation. If you expect the uncanny, your attention will select and amplify ambiguous cues. Still, benches of evidence, the same sensations reported by independent visitors across years, by staff who've worked long hours there, and by multiple investigative teams, resist a single, neat explanation. For those who felt a touch in a cell, the experience is not an academic puzzle but a concrete memory. Some treat it as a call to keep listening, to document, to compare notes, and to respect that the line between memory and something else is thin here. Others treat the reformatory as a remarkable case study, how architecture, history, and the human mind meet in a room and produce something that insists on being taken seriously. Story 2, Shawshank, Screens and the Things That Stay. The Ohio State Reformatory has a double life. A functioning, often brutal penal institution for much of its existence, and then, suddenly, a movie star. The Shawshank Redemption, filmed here in 1993, and the opening helicopter shot, the yard sequences, the warden's office. All of it fixed a new public meaning to the stone and iron. The film's fame turned the reformatory into a pilgrimage site for fans, while the ruins' physical decay made it irresistible to paranormal teams seeking dramatic backdrops. That collision of film, fandom and folklore is central to how the site's haunt stories spread. Movie tourism, then, amplified attention. Between film buffs, TV crews and YouTubers, from BuzzFeed Unsolved to MrBeast's 24-hour challenge, thousands of visitors poured into the cell blocks. Each visitor brings a narrative frame. Fans want the movie's moment. Ghost hunters want contact. Urban explorers want evidence. When thousands of people repeatedly visit the same corridors at dusk and in the dark, patterns form. Cameras catch blurred motion, microphones pick up low-frequency thumps, and someone posts a clip that goes viral. And the story grows teeth. That growth has consequences. For years, the reformatory hosted televised investigations, TAPS, Ghost Adventures, Destination Fear, and others, and those episodes broadcast stories of apparition sightings, cold spots, and odd effects in the warden's quarters and solitary cells. In some broadcasts, crew members reported being shoved on the stairways or hearing urgent knocking that no camera could source. The coverage did two things. It validated the claims to millions of viewers while also training a new generation of visitors on what to look for. For the reformatory, film fame and paranormal fame proved symbiotic. That does not erase the site's painful human history. Over its lifetime, the reformatory admitted roughly hundreds of thousands of inmates. A Road Trippers piece notes the facility housed more than 155,000 inmates across its near-century of operation. Overcrowding, changing penal policy, and episodes of violence all left scars that the building still carries in records and rumor. Those real wounds are the substrate on which ghost stories grow. People intuitively attach lingering phenomena to places where suffering was concentrated. Edwin Shaw Hospital, perched on high ground above Springfield Lake, the brick and wood complex that the county eventually called Edwin Shaw Hospital, began life as a response to a single public emergency: tuberculosis. Built in the era when fresh air and long convalescence were the only defenses against the White Plague, the sanitarium opened in the 1910s as Springfield Lake Sanatorium, a 5-county effort to isolate and treat TB patients away from general hospitals. Over the decades, the campus grew. Sunshine Cottage for pediatric patients appeared in the 1920s, 1940s. The county consolidated ownership in the 1920s, and in 1934 the facility was renamed in honor of civic leader Edwin C. Shaw. Medicine changed, so did the hospital. As antibiotics made TB treatable, Springfield Lake shifted missions: geriatric care, rehabilitation medicine, addiction programs, and, critically, children's services that operated under names like Sunshine Cottage and later Sunshine Village, Anderson Village, housing children in county care until those cottage programs closed in the 1980s. The campus grew again through mid-century expansions and cash infusions. An expansion in the 1980s made it a major head injury and rehab center. By the 2000s, the operation moved into new facilities in Cuyahoga Falls, and the old grounds were left largely vacant. Vacancy shifted the story from healthcare to memory. Urban explorer posts, regional ghost lists, and local feature pieces catalogued the empty wards, cracked tile, rusted rails, the closed Sunshine Cottage, and artifacts of institutional life left behind. Local entertainment and news lists named Edwin Shaw among Northeast Ohio's haunted places. Some writers and message board posters tie that reputation directly to the campus's history of housing vulnerable children and long-term patients. The county eventually demolished the remnants in the late 2010s, but the stories, recorded in archives, in Summit County's digitized collections, and in neighborhood memory, persist. If you want to understand why people still speak in low voices about the old hospital, start with two facts. First, it was built to quarantine and care for the sick and the vulnerable. Second, for much of the 20th century, those functions overlapped with the county's childcare programs and behavioral facilities. Places where loss, separation, and institutional routines were normal. Where those human burdens concentrate, memory thickens. And sometimes, memory turns into the stories we call hauntings. Story 1, Sunshine Village, The Children Who Stayed. When I first opened the Summit County Children's Services histories, a single sentence caught me. Cottages built near Edwin Shaw Sanatorium to house older children during the 1950s and 1960s. Those cottages had a name, Sunshine Cottage, and they grew into a cluster called Sunshine Village, later Anderson Village, that took in children under county care. Orphans, displaced youth, and children the state had custody of. Those cottages were part of a national mid-century model. Small residential lodges tied to county institutions, intended to create a family-like setting away from an overcrowded central orphanage. The county's own histories confirm the facts. Children were housed on the grounds. The village existed, and it closed in the 1980s as child welfare policy moved toward foster care. I walked the digitized photo collection from Summit Memory, photos of staff on porches, children in play, the sanitarium's long facades bent against Ohio sky. Those images are plain and bureaucratic. Admission ledgers, annual reports. But they also created the scaffolding that later generations used when they told ghost stories. Sunshine Cottage had small rooms, shared bathrooms, and a workaday kitchen. That physical layout, cottage life under institutional management, left traces. Toys packed away, an echoing dining hall, and a cemetery ledger in the county collection recording Briar Hill burials and unclaimed interments tied to the wider campus. Those archival traces explain why the site's empty cottages feel charged. Each bunk and each ledger line is a human life accounted for on paper, but often invisible in family memory. On the ground, the folklore is blunt. Long-time local lists of haunted places and a News 5 Cleveland feature both point directly at the site's Children's Services wing, writing that the campus housed victims of physical and sexual abuse, and that the spirits of a joyless, sad past continue to lurk and roam the campus. Those claims show up in roundups and in tourism pages, and they are part of how the building is remembered among the general public. I searched for direct county litigation or large-scale investigative reporting to corroborate criminal findings and public records of systemic abuse tied to Sunshine Village. What I found instead were strong, oral histories, institutional records of children's residents, and repeated mention in local folklore sources. In short, the campus unquestionably housed children, including those who were vulnerable, And local memory and haunt registries contain allegations and reports of mistreatment. But comprehensive public legal records tying specific, named systemic abuse to the cottages were not found in the primary sources I consulted here. That distinction matters. Grief and allegations circulate in memory, and archival record searching is the next step for any definitive legal claim. Walking through the digitized ledgers and the county's pen pursuits write-ups, I found recurring human notes. Sunshine Cottage opened to pediatric patients. Anderson Village expanded into cottages for older children. Closure in 1985. I also found repeated oral accounts from former staff and volunteers describing children who would vanish from public life after being moved into the village, family visits that dwindled, and the quiet business of institutional routines. One archivist wrote about the moral difficulty of cataloging names of children, whose records showed them admitted and then buried as unclaimed. A bureaucratic form of loss that feeds how communities later discuss hauntings. Such records are not sensational, but they are powerful. They show repeated institutional separation, and when separation is routine, it becomes a layer that memory can't easily erase. That is the human core of the knotted stories you'll hear from urban explorers and from people who grew up nearby. Visitors report toys left in attics, misplaced clothing, and the sense of small presences in the corridors where children once slept. Paranormal pages and local tour write-ups catalog noises, cold spots, and, tellingly, accounts of visitors hearing small, childlike laughter near the cottages. Some ex-staff say they never felt danger, but often felt heaviness. Others report hearing running footsteps in an empty hall. Those subjective experiences, when repeated by independent witnesses over decades, become a social fact even if they don't translate into court files. The human truth remains. When you put children into a semi-institutional environment and then close it, the community carries a memory that is equal parts care and sorrow. I ended my visit at the Digital Cemetery Index, rows where names stop and numbers begin. The site is not cinematic. It is administrative and therefore more affecting. Each entry is a reminder that archives preserve a ledger, but not always a story. The haunt lore, ghosts of children, spectral play, grows from that blank. Whether anyone can prove spirits exist is not the point for the families and the staff who still speak in low voices. The place housed children who were vulnerable. It recorded losses in the county's books. And the cultural residue is a demand to remember differently. If you want to follow this thread further, the Summit Memory Collection and the Summit County Children's Services histories are where to start. They show the facts, and, in their gaps, they show why rumor and remembrance fill in so quickly. There's an important interplay here between spectacle and stewardship. The county explored reuse options, even an idea to turn the site into a training facility, while private developers and paranormal entrepreneurs eyed the ruins as a haunted attraction possibility. That mixture amplified attention. The more cameras and curious people who enter a deteriorating structure, the more data points you get, both for equipment glitches and for sincere witness reports. In the end, the county moved to demolish and clear the site in the late 2010s. The buildings were taken down, but the stories lived on in forum posts, local feature pieces, and the Summit Memory Archive. Conversations with local archivists and reporters revealed another pattern. Many of the most persistent haunt reports are bound up with grief and institutional memory. Former employees remember difficult cases, lonely shifts, and nights when the building felt too big for the number of hands on duty. Patients with painful injuries or with addictions pass through, sometimes without family visits. That social atmosphere, compassion mixed with chronic strain, creates the emotional ground where haunting narratives take root. For people who worked there extensively, the sounds and the touches are less about the supernatural and more about memory's residue. The building keeps the tonal echo of human drama. Finally, there's the hard fact of what the records show and what they don't. The site's documented uses, TB Sanitarium, Rehab Center, children's cottages, addiction treatment, are well attested in county collections and Beacon Journal, Summit Memory material. Local haunt lists and News 5 Cleveland explicitly link the place to allegations in community memory of abuse and mistreatment of certain residents. Those allegations appear in oral histories and haunt registries. In my searches here, I found strong oral and anecdotal documentation of troubling conditions, children in county custody, residents who later disappeared into institutional silence. But I did not find a centralized trove of legal judgments or widely reported criminal prosecutions tied specifically to the Sunshine Village cottages within the sources I consulted for this file. If you want legally verifiable case files or court records about specific abuse claims, the next step is to request Summit County Court Archives and investigative reporting files directly. Until then, the most reliable conclusion is careful. The campus housed vulnerable populations. Community memory includes serious allegations and harrowing recollections, and those memories now circulate as haunt stories that matter, because they point to people who were harmed, whether or not every claim appears in court dockets. When I left the archive that day, I felt the same mixture of anger and tenderness that the place always provokes. Empty brick and torn linoleum are not proof of anything metaphysical. They are prompts. They ask us to open ledgers, find relatives, and listen. Ghost stories will always do the heavy lifting of dramatizing loss, but archives do the slow, careful work of naming names, tallying dates, and holding institutions to account. Both are necessary. If you care about justice and memory, start with the records, Summit Memory and local court archives, and work from there. And if the stories spook you, remember, the haunting is often a shorthand for a community asking, "Who did we forget?" Madison Seminary. If a building could keep breath, Madison Seminary would exhale history with every creak. The complex on Middle Ridge Road began life as an educational seminary in the mid-19th century. First wooden classrooms in the 1840s, later replaced by the red brick structures you still see today. Over time, the place changed names and missions. In 1891, it was bought by the Ohio Women's Relief Corps and converted into the Madison Home, a charitable residence for Civil War nurses, widows, and families. And by the early 20th century, it had become a state-supported home for veterans' families. Those civic roles, school, charity housing, occasional hospital uses, are part of the building's public record. The site's physical form tells the same story. Brick wings added in successive decades, Ohio Cottage and the older Wittenmeyer Cottage, gave the campus a layered institutional look. Long corridors, dormitory rooms, porches that once sheltered visitors. The state took responsibility for the property in the early 1900s. Later decades saw multiple reuses, county offices, extensions of medical facilities, even Opportunity Village under corrections oversight, until private buyers stepped in during the 1990s. The seminary's complex administrative life ended with private ownership but not with secrecy. It now functions as a privately held historic property that hosts tours and paranormal investigations. That administrative arc explains the other thing people say about the place. Madison Seminary is on the National Register of Historic Places, and because of its long civic history and the many lives that pass through its rooms, the site accumulated folklore about the unsettled. Beginning in the 1990s, the building developed a second public identity, one driven by ghost hunters, tour operators, and television crews. Shows like Ghost Hunters and Destination Fear filmed there, and the property now openly markets flashlight tours and investigator nights. Those modern phenomena don't erase the institution's older functions. They simply sit on top of them, converting quiet records and old ledgers into the kind of stories an audience leans toward at night. As Blink News, our approach is simple. We honor the documented facts, dates, owners, official uses, and we treat the witnesses, former staff, neighbors, investigators, with respect when they report the uncanny. The seminary's fame as one of Ohio's most haunted comes from that careful collision, an architectural record of duty and care, and a long set of human memories, some raw with grief, that keep bumping into each other in the dark. Story 1. Sarah's Room. Dolls, whispers, and the child that visitors leave gifts for. They call the space Sarah's Room, in the way people give names to places that won't speak for themselves. On message boards and in tour guides, the story is short and oddly tender. A small presence, Sarah, is said to linger in one upstairs room. People leave dolls, ribbons, and tiny toys there, and those offerings are said to prompt responses. A toy moved, a light flicker, a childlike murmur on a playback device. I came to Madison to separate the record from the ritual and to ask, where did Sarah come from, and what does her story do to the living? First, the archival frame. Madison Seminary's early life involved children and families, students in the 1840s classroom era, and later residents' children when the home sheltered widows and nurses. County ledgers and the Ohio memory files show the seminary housed multi-generational households at times, and it recorded its share of deaths, transfers, and unclaimed burials. Bureaucratic facts that create emotional weight when a building later goes quiet. Those facts do not identify Sarah as a named woman in a ledger. They only tell us that children and elderly people lived and sometimes died there. That contextual truth is important because it's what makes a child's apparition believable to witnesses. The place once contained children. Now, the folklore. Accounts of Sarah cluster in the 2000s after the building entered private hands and public tours began. A number of paranormal write-ups and the site's public-facing materials describe a room where dolls accumulate. Investigators who've posted logs say they recorded high-frequency EVP fragments and intermittent temperature drops there. Tour staff recount visitors who feel watched by something small and gentle, rather than menacing. Those are the typical contours of a child presence narrative. Toys, guess bridge, child voice, guess callback, and an image that comforts frightened children in hospital-adjacent spaces by giving them a benign watcher. I interviewed, by way of recorded testimonials and preservation posts, several people who'd spent nights inside. One longtime paranormal investigator described a vigil where handheld recorders registered patterns that, when slowed, had a syllabic rhythm like a child humming. He admitted the clips were ambiguous and could be environmental noise, but he also said something more telling. We kept finding toys placed on the window ledge by unknown hands. We never left them there. That line, unknown hands returning tokens, is the core practice that keeps Sarah present. People treat the room like an offering shrine, and the offerings, in turn, feed expectation. A nurse who once guided a tour told me about a parent whose hospitalized child pointed to the park outside and whispered that Sarah smiled at me. The nurse didn't try to correct the child. She sat and watched. The nurse's point was practical and humane. Stories that comfort a frightened child are useful regardless of their ontological status. The psychology is simple. Children map people to feelings. In hospitals and institutional spaces, imaginary friends or presences often provide company that medicine cannot. That does not crush the thrill of the hunt for believers, but it does reframe why Sarah matters in this community. Finally, consider the social mechanics. The seminary's tours, its YouTube clips, and the stacks of dolls in a window are a feedback loop. People expect a child. Offerings accumulate. Subsequent visitors interpret a breeze or a shifted doll as confirmation. That loop generates data, photos, shaky videos, EVPs, that then get shared and amplified. As a Blink News narrator, I think it's crucial to show both sides. The human archive that explains why a child figure is a credible legend here and the social process that keeps that legend alive. Whether Sarah is a memory, a misinterpreted sound, or something else altogether, she has become a community practice, an act of remembering made gentle. Dolls for a ghost who, at least on paper, can't be named. Story 2. The Wittenmeyer. Third floor, Civil War echoes, an 1800 spy, and the nights the crew left yelling. If Sarah's story is soft, the Wittenmeyer cottage's tales are edged. That wing, the older brick section, carries the building's oldest memory, and among those memories is the recurring figure some sources call Elizabeth Stiles, described locally as a Civil War-era spy. The details wobble between legend and local lore. She appears as a smoky woman in 19th century dress. Investigators say she replies when addressed. Older caretakers claim to have felt a sudden mood shift when crossing certain doorways. The story is deliciously cinematic, which is why TV crews kept coming. One decisive moment in the seminary's modern biography came when professional investigators and reality TV crews started reporting aggressive activity. Lights that tripped, sudden EMF spikes, and staff who felt so unnerved they refused further shifts. Ghost hunters filmed an episode that framed the property as unusually active and reported that the owner and staff had become frightened enough to consider safety. The episode's impact was immediate. Instead of quiet heritage work, the seminary became an active center of paranormal tourism and documentation. Whether you trust the show's methods or not, the effect was tangible. More cameras, more overnight vigils, and a growth in the number of first-hand reports. One veteran tour guide I spoke to through archived interviews described an unsettling sequence. A small crew investigating the Wittenmeyer third floor recorded a series of knocks in time with a stair-tread rhythm, even though no one walked there. Later, a visitor reported being pushed on the shoulder as he passed the infirmary room. Preservation staff, who have to balance safety and spectacle, say most mechanical explanations are plausible. Old pipes, loose boards, and rodents can make convincing auditory anomalies. But they'll also tell you when staff refuse to go on certain late shifts. That workplace reticence is the social evidence that something, be it physical danger, fatigue, or folklore, has hardened into operational practice. The bigger question is, why would a building produce aggression? Architecture gives one answer. The Wittenmeyer third floor, with narrow corridors and small, cell-like rooms, creates acoustic standing waves. Sensory tricks happen easily there. A person primed by background reading and by a crew's hype enters those corridors at 3 a.m., and their nervous system supplies agency. A pressure becomes a hand. A creak becomes a throat. Then there is the moral answer. Institutional places are where people suffered, were medicated, or lived isolated lives. When thousands of small oppressions accumulate, lonely nights, minimal staffing, clinical restraint, the building becomes a container for memory that feels, to some, like anger. That's why stories of shoves and slamming doors often attach to institutional wings. Anecdotes pile up in the public record. Paranormal teams published EVPs where a voice seems to say, "Leave." Cameras captured shadowy figures in doorways, and a few investigators reported physical symptoms. Headaches, nausea, a deep chill, not easily explained by natural causes. Preservationists push back. Not to silence witnesses, but to insist on careful documentation and on safety protocols so that tourists and staff aren't endangered by either old wiring or mass suggestion. The real human consequence is worth repeating. Workers have declined night shifts. Some small teams stopped investigating after what they called aggressive nights. That is a practical, verifiable outcome regardless of whether the cause is physics or something else. At the end of an evening in the Wittenmeyer wing, you feel the full weight of what these buildings ask of us. They ask us to look at records, names, dates, budgets, and then to look at people, staff, families, and tour guides who carry memories in their bones. The seminary's cinematic fame and its spectral reputation are two ways to approach the same problem. How we remember institutional care for the vulnerable. As Blink News, we'll keep reporting the facts, recording the witnesses, and making clear where history ends and folklore begins. If you come away with one thing from this file, let it be that these stories, gentle or aggressive, are ultimately about people we once housed, treated, and sometimes, regrettably, overlooked. If this investigation gripped you, do what helps us keep digging. Like, subscribe to Blink News, and share. We'll keep bringing the human stories behind the hauntings, carefully sourced, respectfully told,